Welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies, live from Sydney. I'm Peter Curti, a research scholar at CIS, and it's a great pleasure to have your company for Raging Against the Past, Why Apologise for History, an important conversation about the supposed justification for the moral judgments we're so fond of making about the past. In Australia, we've witnessed the vandalism of statues commemorating notable figures in the country's history whose opinions or actions are now deemed to dishonour aspects of Australian identity. In the United States, statues associated with Civil War figures such as Robert E. Lee have been pulled down. And in England, the stain of slavery has been deemed to warrant campaigns for the destruction of memorials and statues, such as the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Oxford, or the campaign against the Bristol benefactor Edward Colston. These statue-toppling protesters say that history needs to be corrected and the stigma of racism, colonialism, slavery, or invasion eradicated. But what sense does it make to try and erase the past when the past is the one we've got? And what makes our own moral judgment more worthy than the judgment of those who've gone before? Well, to discuss our contemporary fixation with raging against the past, I'm delighted to be joined from London by the distinguished British jurist Jonathan Sumption, QC, Lord Sumption. Let me begin by asking you about skills that the historian and the lawyer have in common, because both are required to weigh evidence and analyse facts in order to determine the truth about the past. Why does there seem to be such difficulty in deciding what the truth about the past actually means?
Well, there are plenty of people who think it's impossible to discover the truth about the past, that there's no such thing as objective truth. If I agreed with that position, I wouldn't be writing history, but I don't. We can never be completely sure of our an assessment of the past, but we can be pretty sure. The past has a very important role in particularly common law systems, which are basically systems of customary law, which have evolved gradually in response to successive challenges out of the past of the communities that judges serve. It's also an immensely important source of vicarious experience. None of us has enough experience to grapple with all the human problems that judges have to deal with day after day. We need more than one life. We're only, alas, accorded one. The point about history is that as a source of vicarious experience, it's infinitely valuable, a tremendous source of wisdom and experience seen through other eyes.
I mean, over the past 50 years or so, we've seen that history has been just one of a number of disciplines to have been influenced by the rise of post-colonial theory, which interprets truth in terms of power and language and knowledge. How serious do you think the challenge to the discipline of history is that's posed by this kind of political revisionism?
Clearly, the history of European colonization of much of the world was an exercise in power, in influence, and in self-confidence in a specifically European set of values. Some of that has evaporated, but none of it undermines the case for understanding the past. Indeed, we're never likely to have anything sensible to say about the experience of colonialism, whether from the point of view of the colonists or the colonized, unless we do understand the past.
One of the objectives of this revisionism that I've referred to is to urge us that today's generation not only bears guilt for the past, but is actually morally responsible today for the deeds of an earlier generation and needs to apologise for those deeds. But as you have observed, what has happened has happened. So what sense does it make to keep apologising for the past, as people, particularly political leaders and church leaders, seem to do? Why not convey an understanding that what was done was a mistake? Can we efface wrongs committed in the past?
Well, we can. There are, I think, two problems about this movement, which you, I think, correctly diagnose. One is a purely practical one, and the other is a moral one. Let's start with the moral one first. The notion behind apologizing for the past is that there is a concept of collective and inherited guilt. The inheritance occurs on both sides of the equation. The descendants of the victims of whatever wrong it is are deemed entitled to an apology, and the apologizing should be done by those who live in the same country or are descended from the people who did whatever it was. I find this notion of collective and inherited guilt morally repugnant. The most notorious historical example of its deployment is also, I think, demonstrably the most wicked. For many generations, for centuries, the main justification for the persecution of the Jews was that they were hereditarily and collectively responsible for the death of Christ. I think that no one can contemplate that proposition without being repelled by it. I would make exactly the same point of those who say that 21st century Britons are responsible for the Irish potato famine or the Atlantic slave trade, or that 21st century Australians are responsible for some of the worst aspects of the early history of Australia, and indeed the much more recent history of its treatment of Aboriginal people. These are terrible things from which we should learn. We are not going to learn from them unless we understand them. And that's a historical process.
Yes.
The practical point is a different one. The past has happened. You can protest about what is currently happening. You can protest about what you think may be about to happen. Many people do, and the justification of that is that it might change attitudes and lead to a different present or future. But you can't change the past. All that you can really do about the past is to express your own indignation. And I think that the main motivation behind those who pull down statues is essentially to show which side they are on. This is a completely useless exercise. Nobody nowadays thinks that slavery is morally justifiable. Values were different in the 17th and 18th century, but nobody thinks that now. So we're all on the same side. All that is achieved by pulling down statues is to show that some people are even more outraged about this than others. But the outrage of individuals is a completely insignificant fact. It's not going to achieve anything except material destruction of, for example, statues. So the practical objection to this is that it is completely pointless piece of personal exhibitionism by people who want to demonstrate that they are on the right side with even more fury and vigor than everybody else.
In his review of your most recent book, Law in a Time of Crisis, David Runciman criticized this, the view that you've just stated, that it's irrational and absurd to try to remake the past. Runciman said this, he said, people who pull down statues are not trying to change the past, they're trying simply to change how we commemorate it in the present. How do you respond to that criticism, which is a slightly subtle variation on the point that you are making? Isn't it reasonable, after all, to allow that people might wish to rethink the ways they commemorate the past?
Well, it's not a question of rethinking. We all agree that slavery was a bad thing. That doesn't require any further thought. Nobody sane, anyway, needs to be persuaded today that slavery was an appalling injustice. So I would agree with David Runciman's view that what people are doing is not trying to remake the past. I don't even think that they're trying to efface it. They're trying to demonstrate the intensity of their own opinions about the past. But my view that that is a useless thing to do remains unchanged. It doesn't achieve anything, and the strength of individual feelings is not a matter of any great importance. There are many things that I feel indignant about, but what is to be gained by my simply expressing myself in ever stronger terms. You do not actually improve the case for any proposition by lading full of expletives. And essentially, the statue wreckers are simply adding an expletive to what is already completely common ground.
And I think an important point about this, and I'll come back to the statue wreckers in a moment. It seems to me is that people who are so indignant about this pay nothing like the kind of attention that needs to be paid to the persistence of slavery in parts of the world today. It seems to me that it's much easier to criticize people in the past for an association with slavery than to try to tackle complex political problems today in countries where slavery persists. And I wonder why it is that campaigners expend so little of their energy on those sorts of issues.
Well, it's partly because their views have even less relevance in the kind of countries which still countenance slavery than they do in Western countries. That's sometimes expressed by the statement that many of these people hate their own country. I don't actually think that that is true, but I certainly think that the desire to express one's own indignation has more resonance in one's own community than it does elsewhere.